Hi, and welcome back. I'm finally going to tackle what might be the most requested review ever on my channel, the Kirchhoff EQ plugin from Free Body Technology and Plugin Alliance. You may have noticed a slight reluctance to tackle this one on my part, mostly because I don't think I'm going to be able to avoid bias. This plugin is clearly inspired by the FabFilter EQ, and I have many reasons to be biased in favour of the FabFilters. ProQ and its successors have been my go-to EQ for over a decade now. I know it intimately, having made official tutorial videos for every new version. And furthermore, the FabFilters have been exemplary clients over the years, and are also a lovely bunch of cool Dutch people that I've hung out with socially. I have reasons to feel a sense of loyalty to the FabFilters, and to feel vicariously offended by how brazenly Free Body Technology have copied their interface design. To be fair, now that I have the interface in front of me, it isn't just a FabFilter clone, and I'm never going to forget which one I'm using. But the styling is close enough that a casual observer could easily just assume you're using ProQ 3, and ethical questions aside, I wonder if this is a wise marketing choice. Feature-wise, Kirchhoff is not just a FabFilter clone, it's quite clearly aimed at the tweakier, more control freak kind of user, judging from the feature list. I wonder if they would have been better advised to choose a radically different colour scheme to carve out their own identity. Maybe some vibrant reds and oranges instead of this purpley blue thing. Anyway, enough preamble. Let's talk about the most important factor of a plugin like this, and the reason I switched to using the FabFilter EQ all those years ago. No, it's not the feature list, as extensive as it is. It's not the audio quality, because, quite frankly, I expect that to be basically perfect in a plugin like this. It's the ergonomics. I actually was quite opposed to EQs with graphic displays like this. I learned to EQ with my ears, and didn't like having a wild-looking graphic curve to make me doubt them. But I learned to overcome that, because the FabFilter interface allows me to work quicker than any knob-based traditional-style plugin EQ, and ironically gets me a lot closer to the feeling of being in control that I used to enjoy when mixing on an analogue console that I knew really well. So let's see if the Kirchhoff matches up. First of all, I can drag that centre line to add a new bell-shaped band. Check. I can adjust the Q with the mouse wheel while dragging the node around to adjust frequency and gain. Check. I can double-click somewhere to just put a node right there. Check. I can lasso multiple nodes and adjust them together. Check. And when I adjust the gains of multiple bands, they're scaled around unity, rather than just moving up or down together. Check. I can drag from the left or right to add low or high shelving bands. Check. I can't double-click to the left or right to add a high or low pass filter. That one is missing. I've tried all the usual key modifiers, but I can't find any quick way to add a high pass filter. It seems you have to go through the menu. So they almost nailed the ergonomics, but they dropped the ball with the high and low pass filters, and I fear this is a small detail that's going to annoy me disproportionately when using it in anger. Okay, let's talk about audio quality. I've seen people claim that Kirchhoff sounds better than the FabFilter plugin, that ProQ 3 has a plasticky sound, whatever that means, that the Kirchhoff lacks. I get a strong whiff of bullshit from such claims, so let's see if we can freshen the air with a spray of null test. I'll start with a low shelf at 100Hz, 12 dB of boost with the Q set to 1, and then I'll match those settings in Kirchhoff, 100Hz plus 12 dB, Q equals 1. And somewhat to my surprise, we immediately get a perfect null. Why am I surprised by that? Well, because the FabFilter EQ uses a non-standard definition of Q. Setting it to 1 in the FabFilter gives the steepest possible slope with no resonant bump. But the standard definition of Q would have this at 0.71 instead. I was expecting to have to explain why I needed to set Kirchhoff's Q to 0.71 to match a setting of 1 in Q3, but apparently Kirchhoff has also adopted this non-standard, but rather more intuitive way of defining Q. Anyway, the important point is they null, so they sound the same. No plasticky artifacts from Q3 so far. Okay, let's try switching to a bell instead. And there's a big no null there. However, the size and nature of this difference suggests to me that we've not matched the Q correctly. They're both still set to 1. Let's try the Kirchhoff at 0.71 instead. And there's the null again. Interestingly, Kirchhoff seems to have borrowed the FabFilter Q definition for the shelving types, where that is definitely more intuitive and helpful, but stuck with the standard definition for the bell filters, where it doesn't really make much difference. That seems fair enough. And it doesn't actually matter in practice, of course, because if you're not setting the Q by ear instead of by the numbers, you're doing it wrong. But it is important to know this if you're trying to compare it to another EQ which defines Q differently. Anyway, it's a null. It's dropped below my usual -100 dB don't care threshold. Let's try looking a little deeper, just out of interest. There is some difference, down at -110 or so. This might be a good time to remember that the 0.71 value I gave for Q is actually an approximation. It should really be 1/√2. And the Kirchhoff gives us a totally unnecessary 3 decimal places of precision for the parameter value. So let's try typing in a more accurate 0.707 instead. The differences drop off the display again, and I really don't care about them now. Let's try 1 kHz. A bit of difference in the higher frequencies, but really tiny though. If I hadn't changed the graph scale lower limit, we wouldn't see this at all. 10K. More difference now. I guess they've taken slightly different approaches to decramping. This doesn't surprise me. These could, in theory, sound very slightly different. And we get similar results comparing the high shelves. Can I be bothered to set up a listening comparison for these, given that I really don't expect to be able to hear the difference? Maybe. I'll think about it. Meanwhile, we haven't finished our null testing. Notice that Q3 is set to the default 0 latency mode, while Kirchhoff is set to minimum, which is also 0 latency. So let's set Q3 to natural phase instead, and switch Kirchhoff to analogue, which is its equivalent. I know this is confusing. Some industry standardization of these terms would be useful, frankly. I know many people get confused by these modes, so I'll briefly summarize them. 0 latency mode on Q3 and minimum mode in Kirchhoff are both minimum phase, like in analogue EQ. They both fix the high-frequency cramping that's common to digital EQs at the expense of a tiny bit of extra phase shift in the highest frequencies. Natural phase in Q3 and analog mode in Kirchhoff are both still minimum phase, like in analog EQ, but these modes fix the cramping with some extra latency and without any erroneous phase shift. The difference is actually tiny. If you're working in the lower or mid-range frequencies, you might as well stick with 0 latency or minimum options, as the natural phase analog versions will give identical results. And even in the higher frequencies, that extra phase shift you get in 0 latency or minimum mode is tiny and totally insignificant in most cases. Anyway, the point is they're nulling again. Really amazingly perfectly, in fact. It seems that both Q3 and Kirchhoff can get closer to the ideal model when some latency is permitted, and therefore, logically, they get closer to each other. So I come to 2 conclusions. If you set these EQs the same, they sound the same. In every respect, except possibly the highest frequencies in their respective 0 latency modes. And that YouTuber I saw gushing over the Kirchhoff's superior sound was definitely talking out of the wrong orifice, given that he wasn't comparing them in the high frequencies. Shall we do the listening test? Oh, go on then. Here's a mix that can take a healthy high-frequency boost. Here it is with that boost. Can you tell which is which? I'm happy to say they both sound equally good to me. And it's kind of moot, as if I were applying this kind of boost over a whole mix, I would normally be using the natural phase or analog mode anyway. Now, some of you might be objecting at this stage. I've missed the super high bit depth option at the top. Obviously, if I turn that option on, the plasticky sound will go away and Kirchhoff will shine out as clearly superior to the fab filter, right? Actually, there's a better way to assess this option than comparing to Q3. I'm going to null test the Kirchhoff against itself. Here's a fairly complex setup with multiple bands, and here's a duplicate, exactly the same but with the 114-bit option enabled. Let's null them, and there's nothing left. Okay, I wonder just how quiet the differences really are. Let's adjust the graph range, and that's as low as it will go. Maybe I need to boost the noise level. Let's up it by 20 dB so the noise is at full scale. Still nothing. This button doesn't seem to make any difference whatsoever. Maybe it gets more significant when using the dynamics. Yes, I am going to talk about that, by the way, all in good time. Meanwhile, here's some drums running through a setting with lots of dynamic action. Let's null that against a 114-bit copy. Still nothing. I'm tempted to declare this button just a placebo. Except, the important thing about a placebo is that it's harmless. I can detect one difference when I enable 114-bit mode. The CPU load goes up by a factor of 4, according to Reaper's CPU meter. That's more than when you enable oversampling, and both together starts to get really hungry. So it's not a placebo button, it's a would you like to waste resources button, a would you like your CPU fan to spin up button, a do you want slower renders for no good reason button. Perhaps you can tell I'm not impressed. Note that it's possible that there are settings or combinations of settings that might benefit from this option that I'm unaware of. But in that case, I think it's up to the developers to make sure that the internal resolution changes when the appropriate circumstances arise. It's not reasonable to expect the user to know when it's necessary. I did check that section of the manual, by the way, but I'm not any the wiser for it. Okay, let's talk about filter slopes. The FabFilter EQ allows you to change the slope for all filter types in 6 dB per octave steps, up to 96 dB per octave. Kirchhoff also provides a slope parameter for all filter types, but this time it's a continuously variable knob instead, allowing for arbitrary filter slopes of any steepness you want. I don't think I've ever seen this option on any other EQ, so I'll tip my hat to the developers for some clever DSP trickery here. I was curious to see what happens to the phase with the in-between settings, and it just transitions smoothly between the different states, with no weirdness or discontinuities anywhere. Well done, guys, this is quite impressive. How useful is it, though, when it comes to mixing? That's actually a very good question. Speaking personally, I hardly ever use the steeper slopes for bell or shelving bands. It's not that I think the steeper slopes sound bad, although obviously the very steepest settings won't be appropriate most of the time. It's more that I don't think the difference between this 12 dB setting and this 24 dB setting matters very much. If you're EQing individual channels within a mix, probably either of these settings will work just as well, and as a consequence, most of the time I quickly get the result I need with the default 12 dB setting and don't even bother to try a steeper slope. The exception is low or high-pass filtering, especially high-pass. I regularly use the 6, 12, 18 and 24 dB settings for high-pass filters. But I've never found myself wishing for any in-between settings. Between adjusting the Q and fine-tuning the frequency, I never have any difficulty setting it as I want it. So my inclination is to conclude that this continuous slope capability isn't really important, and might even be a distraction from that which is really important. But I can't state that with any certainty, as I haven't yet tried using it in a real mix. And in truth, I'm not convinced that my 14-day demo period is long enough to allow me to come to a more informed view. Perhaps I will have a firmer opinion by the end of the video. Anyway, we've touched on the issue of differences in EQ shape, so let's talk about a feature that Kirchhoff offers for which there is no equivalent at all in Pro Q3, the analogue modelled curves. If I click to open the filter types menu, we see all the usual bell, shelf, high pass, low pass options. But down at the bottom of the list, we also get a bunch of options modelled from famous analogue hardware. You can choose SSL style bands or Neve style. And that's going to give you all the magic of an SSL or Neve console, right? First of all, let's make it clear what this does and doesn't do. These filter types have different frequency responses to the default bell and shelf types and might produce different curves with the same settings. They don't add any kind of saturation, however. Kirchhoff remains resolutely linear. No harmonics are added. Opinions may vary as to how much the saturation of a classic console contributes to the sound, but if you're of the opinion that it's important, you'll have to find it elsewhere. This plugin just gives you linear versions of the EQ curves. Also, at risk of stating the obvious, the interface doesn't change when you change filter type. Granted, you get a different type of knob on the control panel, but we still have the same basic paradigm of draggable nodes on a frequency response graph. For me, the magic of a Pultec is not really in the specific EQ curves it provides, nor the tube saturation, which is usually more subtle than most people think, but rather in the quirky and unusual control system, and specifically the lack of a frequency response graph. This is why I might get different results from a Pultec-style EQ. And there's none of that in the Kirchhoff EQ. You get the curve shapes and nothing else. Now, full disclosure, I didn't expect to find this feature useful when I read about it in the feature list, for reasons I'll elaborate on shortly. So I might just be confirming my own bias. But in fact, I hated this feature a lot more than I expected to. Let's quickly list the things I think are wrong with the current implementation. Those abbreviated names are horrible. Even if you don't have to squint to read them like me, the abbreviations are too obscure and need too much brain energy diverting to decode them. Seriously, Brit NHS? Sounds like you're making a political point about socialised healthcare. Who decided to group them by console type rather than filter type? If I'm looking for an alternative to the standard high shelf, I want to see a list of alternative high shelves. Don't waste my time with irrelevant bells and high-pass filters, and don't make me peek inside folders that might not even have an equivalent filter type. Some of these EQ types can only boost and not cut, or vice versa. Like this vintage tube high boost, which I'm guessing is based on a Pultec. The gain knob still goes negative, but doesn't do anything. This is a complete dog's breakfast, if you ask me. But here's my biggest objection. When you switch filter type, the effective frequency of your cut or boost might change. Now let's imagine for a moment that I'm an experienced professional and I know how to tune an EQ properly. That EQ band that I dialed in using the default standard curves, that's exactly where I want it to be. So when I switch to one of the different types and the filter moves up or down, that's guaranteed to be wrong, right? What it means, in practice, is that every time you switch filter type, you also have to compensate the frequency setting. And proper, meaningful A-B comparisons can only be done using the A-B switching at the top. This works, but it's a slow and tedious way to assess half a dozen different high-shelf options like we have here. Ah, you might object, but that's just an accurate representation of the original hardware and an important part of the model. To which I would say, Tish and Fipsy. When you're using an SSL channel EQ, you never know exactly what frequency it's tuned to. The knob gives you a rough idea, and you tune it in by ear. It absolutely doesn't matter if the frequency control is scaled the same way as the hardware. It makes no difference at all if you're doing it right. And normalizing the frequency controls to make them consistent across the different filter types would in no way limit their ability to sound like the original hardware. But it would allow you to switch between the different high-shelf types and hear the real differences between them without having to compensate the frequency every time. There are two possible reasons I can think of why the developers might have chosen not to do this. They may be convinced that the inaccurate frequency scaling is an important part of the emulation. I disagree strongly, but ultimately this is a matter of opinion and they're entitled to theirs. But there's a much more cynical explanation. If the frequency controls were in fact normalised, it would become clear how subtle and ultimately insignificant most of the differences are. This is the fundamental problem I have with the concept that I alluded to earlier. Ultimately, the difference between this SSL-style high shelf and this one using the default shelf filter is not going to matter most of the time. And the difference between this vintage tube boost and this one with the standard bell filter is definitely never going to matter, given that they null. Yes, really. Granted, some of the filter types are more unusual. This tone stack low shelf, for example. But even that can be matched almost exactly using a standard low shelf plus a standard high shelf. Because I don't believe there's anything magic about the particular curves you get from an SSL or an Eve or a Pultec. The sound of those consoles that we hear on all those classic records is much more to do with great musicians in a great room, not to mention the skills of the engineer operating that console, than it is to do with the console or the quirks of its EQ design. I don't believe in magic, except in the music itself. So I fear this feature is really just a distraction from the important task, deciding which frequencies to cut and which frequencies to boost. That's what you should be worrying about, not whether to use E or G style SSL curves. If you really must include this kind of curve modelling, I have some suggestions to make it more useful in practice. First of all, if the original hardware only did boost, give us the option to cut anyway, and just make it the reciprocal of the boost. If we want authenticity, we can just avoid cutting, right? Because this current half the knob travel does nothing implementation is pants. After all, if it's okay for you to add a Q control to a Neve-style EQ, and I'm fine with that personally, it's definitely okay to add attenuation to a Pultec-style high bell. Next, we need to be able to switch type for multiple bands at once. That's not possible at the moment due to that train wreck of a list of filter types. I want to be able to select a typical 4-band configuration of low shelf, 2 bells and high shelf, and switch them all to the Neve or SSL styles in one go, with the low shelf becoming the equivalent Neve or SSL style low shelf, and the bells becoming Neve or SSL style bells, and so on. For extra points, have the plugin analyse the current magnitude plot, then optimise the settings so the new filter types match that magnitude as closely as possible. And for extra points, let us switch type for all bands of all instances of the plugin in one go, so we can switch our entire virtual console to Neve or SSL or even Pultec. The question now ceases to be, what would these exact settings sound like on a Neve or SSL, but rather, how close would it be possible to get to this mix using a Neve or SSL? And that's a much more interesting and useful question to have answered, in my opinion. Future Dan here, jumping in with an edit, because it occurred to me that there's a possible workflow that negates most of my criticism. Let's say you're an SSL guy, used to dialing in E-series curves. If you open the settings at the top right, you can define the SSL E curves as the default filter types. Then every new band you add will be an SSL, and you can just ignore the other options. If you're not switching between different filter types, most of my criticisms no longer apply. And if you're of the opinion that the continuous slope parameter is an unnecessary distraction, I'm not there yet. This solves that problem as well. You've just got the standard controls now. And while I'm here, I discovered there are theming settings in this section as well, so I can create that red-themed skin I imagined earlier. Or try to anyway. Visual design is not my strong suit. For some reason I wasn't able to set my channel logo as a background image. Maybe it doesn't like PNG files. I didn't investigate that any further though. Okay, I'm going to jump back to those processing modes we talked about earlier, and there are 2 more that I didn't mention. Linear phase is exactly equivalent to the linear phase mode in Q3, which I rarely use personally. But the mixed mode is more unusual, and there's no equivalent for it in the FabFilter plugin. In this mode, the EQ is minimum phase in the lower frequencies, and linear phase in the higher frequencies. Let's see how that looks in Plugin Doctor. Here's a low-frequency bell boost with phase shift. But if I tune it higher, above about 1 kHz, we get progressively less phase shift. Then it's flat above about 4K. This is obviously aimed at those people that like to use linear phase for high-frequency adjustments, but not for lower frequencies, where the pre-ringing is a bigger issue. However, I'm not one of those people that think linear phase high EQ sounds better than minimum phase EQ. I'm always perfectly happy with the minimum phase versions myself. I'm not saying you're wrong if you like linear phase high-frequency boosts. You might be hearing subtle differences that I'm oblivious to. But it does mean I'm not qualified to judge this feature at all. I don't know what you're hearing when you prefer the linear phase boost, so I don't know what to listen for. All I can say is, it seems to work as advertised, but I probably won't bother with it. So what should I look at next? Here's another reason I've procrastinated this review somewhat. This plugin is a monster, and I'm starting to wonder if I'll get through everything within my demo period. Alright then, stereo options. Q3 allows each band to be switched individually between the left and right channels, or the mid and side channels. Very useful options that I reach for regularly, especially the mid and side. Kirchhoff gives us all the same options, but also provides a slider in stereo mode with which we can pan that band left or right, or in mid-side mode from mid to side. This seems like a nice option to have, though it has one minor consequence. Switching from stereo to mid-side mode won't make any difference unless you also adjust the slider below. If the slider stays in the middle, these are duplicate options that give identical results. This might possibly cause some confusion. Someone might switch to mid-side mode, assuming that the band is now only affecting the side channel, without realising that they also need to drag the slider right, or else switch to the side mode instead. That's a minor quibble, however. Let's talk about how useful the feature is in stereo mode first of all. There are two reasons I might choose to EQ the left and right channels differently. If I have a lumpy stereo file that's not well balanced across the frequencies, then I might need to boost or cut frequencies in just one channel, or in one channel more than the other. Honestly though, that was a more common problem back in the analogue days with manually matched left and right channels, or badly aligned tape heads. It's pretty easy to keep left and right channels matched in digital, and I can't remember when I last needed to make those kinds of corrections. The other reason is creative. EQing the left and right channels differently is a great way to add width and depth to a mono source, and can sometimes even be a viable alternative to a short early reflections type reverb. But in that case, I tend to want more drastic differences than this slider allows for. Typically, I want the other channel to have the opposite gain setting, rather than just less of the same, and the slider can't invert a cut into a boost, or vice versa. Or I might want both channels boosted, but at slightly different frequencies. In fact, I can do precisely that in Volcano 3, using the pan ring around the frequency knob. Is it unfair of me to bring up a totally different FabFilter plugin? Probably, but I did warn you. Okay, then back to Pro Q3. There's no ring around the frequency knob here, but there is a little scissor icon, which splits the stereo band into separate left and right bands, so I can now offset the frequency slightly, or invert the gain, or whatever. Kirchhoff gives us the left-right slider, but there's no obvious way to split the stereo band into individual left and right bands, as there is in Q3. Mid-side EQ is something I use a lot more often, especially on buses. But again, I very rarely end up with the same cuts or boosts, but with different amounts of gain. Typically, I will have a band for just the mid or side channel. The slider just represents an extra step you have to take in that case, compared to just picking the mid or side channel directly. Or I'll have opposing cuts and boosts at the same frequency to widen or narrow that frequency without changing the overall amount of energy too much. In which case you're going to need two separate bands in the Kirchhoff EQ, just like in Q3, and the slider doesn't help. So I'm going to conclude that for my personal workflow, the scissors band split option in Q3 is more useful than the slider in Kirchhoff, and I'm going to give the FabFilter a win in this regard. Yes, it's possible that I only prefer the FabFilter approach because I'm used to it. I did warn you. Final point about the stereo options. Perhaps the most interesting behaviour is with high or low pass filters, but curiously there's no indication of what's happening on the plugin interface, so I'll have to show it in Plugin Doctor. If you add a stereo high pass filter, then pan it left. The right channel turns into a low shelf cut, then flattens out once you're hard panned. And here's what that does to your phase. I'm quite fond of using different high-pass filters for the left and right channels to deliberately create phase differences and widen the lower frequencies, and this seems like a nice and easy way to do that quickly. A word of warning, however. The frequency response I see in Plugin Doctor suggests very much that they've achieved this by means of a simple dry-wet mix for the channel you're panning away from. Check out my parallel filters video to see what I'm talking about. Which means that in the minimum and analogue modes, higher slope settings are going to get really funky. 24 dB is already a little odd, with this big dip appearing near the cutoff frequency, and the results get progressively funkier the higher you go. This behaviour seems strangely naive in DSP terms, especially when contrasted with the cleverness of the continuous slopes. Okay, I can't put it off any longer. Let's talk dynamics. This represents the biggest difference in approach compared to the FabFilter EQ. Here's the dynamics option in Q3, just a ring around the gain knob. That's it. You can, if you wish, set the threshold manually, but that's all the control you get. Everything else is just handled for you automatically. Now let's press the dynamics button in Kirchhoff, and a large, daunting panel slides open, bristling with controls. And not just the standard compressor controls either. I managed to figure out most of it myself, but still needed to consult the manual before proceeding with this section of the video. Clearly, there's a profound difference in philosophy between the two plugins, so let me try to sum up each approach. If you're dialing in dynamics for a specific frequency, like this bell boost, you're probably trying to control the dynamics rather than shape the dynamics creatively. The narrower the range of frequencies you're affecting with the EQ, the less likely that this kind of dynamic shaping will have any significant effect on the sound. So the only purpose for attack and release controls in this case would be to tune the dynamics processing to be as transparent as possible. Now, I happen to think that the FabFilter developers are particularly good at designing cleverly program-dependent dynamics algorithms that can adapt to a wide range of different source material. I'll cite the one-knob compression in Saturn as an example, which just sounds good on anything. And the fact that their limiter plugin is highly regarded, and good limiting is all about clever program dependency. So the FabFilter team have decided to make the dynamics program-dependent and transparent, and remove the need for you to worry about tuning attack and release to optimize that. However, it's fair to say that dynamic EQ could also mean a shelf covering a fairly wide range of frequencies. Attack and release times start to matter a lot more in that case, and you might have valid creative reasons to want to adjust them beyond just maximizing transparency. But Q3 doesn't provide those options. The FabFilter team would probably respond to this criticism by saying you're using the wrong plugin. Q3 isn't intended as a tool to shape dynamics. They have ProMB for that instead, which provides all the usual compressor controls and more. So are these two different philosophies just different and equally valid? Or can I come to a view regarding which is better? Let's quickly run through the controls and what they do. There's a threshold knob, which seems clear enough. However, the dynamics action can happen above the threshold, or below the threshold, or both at once. If you want standard compression behavior, that means above the threshold, and you need a negative range setting for downwards compression. Now, what about the ratio? This is set as a percentage, which is odd. Now, I happen to think percentage works quite well as a substitute for ratio. It maps well to a linear knob, giving you all the control you need everywhere you need it. The problem is, everyone, including myself, is used to ratio readouts instead, so you need to translate in your head. 50% means a 2-to-1 ratio, I assume. The default 75% setting is probably about 4-to-1. 100% will be hard limiting. Interestingly, the parameter keeps going. You can go beyond limiting into ducking territory. This is occasionally a useful option, but most of the time it just sounds bad, so you'll need to avoid going there if you want transparent compression. Now, we could also add more processing below the threshold as well. Turning the range control up into positive values gives us upward compression, while negative values give downward expansion, which becomes more like a gate if you increase the ratio percentage. However, notice that both above threshold and below threshold processing appear to share the same attack and release controls, which, in my opinion, quite significantly limits the usefulness of having both options. If you're doing both upward and downward compression, for whatever reason, then perhaps they might both need the same attack and release smoothing. But a downward expansion setting rarely needs the same ballistics as a downward compressor, at least in my experience. I don't think I'm asking for individual attack and release controls, though. Honestly, this dynamics panel is scary enough already. Rather, I think I'm questioning the wisdom of allowing for both types of processing simultaneously. One set of these controls with an above or below threshold button would be much clearer and more intuitive, in my opinion. Or even better, an expansion or compression button with the range determining whether that's upward or downward. So I was able to figure out that section on my own. But as we move further to the right, I got progressively less confident in my assessments, and by the time I got to these last two parameters, I was totally lost and had to grab the manual. So before I talk about that section, I'm going to go back to Q3 again and talk about what happens if you don't choose to set the threshold manually. It's set automatically in that case, but importantly, it's not static. The threshold rides up and down depending on the overall level of the broadband signal, while the actual dynamics processing is keyed from the level of the frequency band it's tuned to. That's my guess as to how it works, at least. All of that stuff is opaque to the user. You don't need to know any of it, because it mostly just works as you expect. You can tame those lumpy dynamics with one knob, then move on. Kirchhoff is kind of similar in a sense, but in another sense completely and utterly different. We have two detectors, as I assume is the case behind the scenes in the FabFilter plugin. One of these detectors is broadband by default and can control the effective threshold, while the other is tuned to the same frequencies as the EQ band by default and keys the actual dynamics processing. Both these detectors can be switched to just the left or right, or mid or side channels if required. And you can set both to free filtering mode. For the upper detector, that means you can set it to key from a different frequency to that which is being processed. For the lower detector, you can limit its bandwidth, so it's not keying from the full range signal anymore. Over to the right, we have a parameter called relative. Set this to 0, and we have conventional dynamics processing. The compression or expansion is driven by the upper detector, and the lower isn't used. This is equivalent to setting the threshold manually in Q3. But if you set the relative parameter to 100%, the threshold is now floating and controlled by that lower envelope detector. The threshold is no longer absolute and fixed, despite the appearance of the knob, but now rides up and down according to the overall signal levels, or the level of that part of the signal you've isolated with the free filter mode. This is equivalent to the default automatic threshold behavior in Q3, with the obvious difference being that in Q3 you don't need to have any clue what's going on under the hood, while in Kirchhoff you really need to know what you're doing. In case your head isn't already spinning, turn up the onsets parameter to key the dynamics from transients instead of peak levels. What happens if you turn up the onsets and relative at the same time? Are we now comparing the transientness of the targeted frequency to the transientness of the whole signal? Yes, I'm aware that I've just invented the word transientness, but I felt like I needed it. Anyway, I guess the answer is yes, but I've no idea how or when I would actually use that option. Okay, so let's look at a possible use case where some of these tweaky options might be useful. Here's some drums. The snare sounds a bit dull though, and needs more 3K. But when I boost that frequency, the cymbals and percussion start to get really obnoxious. Let's imagine this is a drum loop I found in a sample pack. I didn't throw it together to demo this technique, and I can't go back and remix it. All I've got is this stereo file. So let's put that band back at Unity, or maybe even a little below, and see if we can catch the snare with some upward expansion. That's above threshold processing, and we'll want a positive range value, but only a few dB, not too much. I'm going to set the ratio actually very high. This would be way too high normally for an upward expander, but it's okay in this case because we're limiting it with the range. What I want is for every snare hit to immediately trigger all of that upward expansion and go all of the way up to the range limit, even if it's only a tiny bit over the threshold. So let's tune that threshold to catch just the snares. And we still have a problem. If I set the threshold low enough to catch the snare drums, we also get triggering from those cymbals, etc. And if I set the threshold to exclude the cymbals and percussion, we also lose the snares. Okay, then let's take things a step further. I'll switch the main detector to free filter mode. And now we see this little bar on the graph to indicate the sidechain filters. When I grab this to tune it, it switches to listen mode automatically, which is a nice touch. Let's find the most prominent part of the snare, which is, as usual, the low fundamental, and is easy to identify with the analyzer. And I'll also narrow down the filtering using my mouse wheel. Great. Now I can tune the threshold again, and can very easily find a setting that reacts to the snares while ignoring the cymbals. Final tweak. Lower frequencies are slower than higher frequencies, kind of by definition. So I sometimes find this kind of setting can benefit from a little touch of look ahead, so the expansion doesn't miss any of the initial transient. Notice that I've left the relative knob firmly at 0%. I've got the results I want without needing the extra complexity, so I'm just going to leave it well alone. And this kind of highlights the huge difference in workflow between this and the FabFilter plugin. In Q3, that relative floating threshold behavior is the default option that just works without you having to switch your brain out of creative mode. While in Kirchhoff, it's a slightly scary advanced option that even I avoid if possible. My plan for this video has changed during the testing and script writing stage. Initially, I assumed I would be doing A/B comparisons between the dynamics algorithms, but I changed my mind because, frankly, they're not comparable at all. I now consider them completely different tools with totally different use cases, and comparing them directly wouldn't be very helpful. Regarding their relative usefulness, I use the Pro Q3 dynamics quite often. Perhaps not every mix. Plenty of great mixes were made with no dynamic EQ whatsoever, after all. But still, it's often useful. You could, on the other hand, have a long and successful audio engineering career without ever needing the tweaky options in the Kirchhoff. These are the kind of options I like to have in my plugin folder, just in case, but I hardly consider essential. The other thing I changed my mind about. I was planning to do a mix using Kirchhoff exclusively for all my EQ duties. I changed my mind on that, partly because I can see my demo period ticking down, but mostly because I've got concerns about Kirchhoff's stability. I've had several crashes while testing the plugin and writing the script, and I'm expecting more while actually capturing the video. Typically, I've left a project open while going to make coffee, then returned to find it frozen. On many of those occasions, all I had in the project was one Kirchhoff and one Pro Q3, and I know which I'm going to blame in that case. It's incredibly rare for FabFilter plugins to crash on me, even at the beta testing stage, and the release builds are absolutely rock solid. There's a level of instability that I might tolerate in a creative plugin that I use from time to time, but if you aspire to replace Q3 as the go-to EQ that I load with a hotkey, with dozens of instances in literally every project, you need to do a whole lot better than that. So that's a deal breaker for me, but I would stress that this might be peculiar to my setup. So if Kirchhoff appeals to you otherwise, you should definitely demo it for yourself. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Kirchhoff is an impressive plugin, and I'll be interested to see how it matures over time. It's perhaps worth remembering that the FabFilters have been refining their version for well over a decade, while Kirchhoff appeared out of the blue relatively recently. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I don't normally nag you about that, but I'm creeping up to the magic 96k mark, which seems worth celebrating. Will that mean less aliasing in the comments section? Okay, bye for now.